Well, it's now time to bring you the first part of our interview segment on the show today. Now we're focusing on the automotive sector of the economy. Now, the automotive suppliers for last year saw quite an interesting play out from shortages, increased cost as well, and then we're also seeing supply chain disruptions as lockdowns of 2020 quickly gave way to shortages of many raw materials and components as supply could not keep up with surging demand. Now, with no end in sight, the semiconductor chip shortages is now expected to cost the global automotive industry $210 billion in revenue this year, as the forecast is almost double its previous projection of $110 billion in the month of May. Now, although everyone had hoped that the chip prices would have abated more by now, but unfortunately, events such as the COVID-19 lockdowns and the continued problems of the Russia-Ukraine crisis and other elements continue to exacerbate pressure on automakers across the globe, including Ford Motors, and we also have General Motors having warned of massive earnings cut. This is due to the chip shortages. Well, to give us more insight into the developments within the automobile sector and its ripple effect on the Nigerian economy as well and the industry here in Nigeria, I'm now being joined virtually by the co-founder of AutoCheck Africa, Mohammed Ayamu. Thank you very much for joining us on the show today, Mr. Ayamu.
Thank you much for having me.
Now, let's start this conversation really with your assessment of the half-year activities in the auto sector and how well you think global players from the United States to Europe and Asia have fared in navigating through supply chain issues and this lingering global semiconductor chip shortages. Your thoughts on these?
I think we've seen tremendous recovery from the players. China, for example, is up by 28% so far in terms of manufacturing. Europe up by about 23%, and then the US up by 8% across board in terms of manufacturing. Bringing it closer to home in Africa, Morocco as well saw a huge increase last year, almost touching their all-time high of about 418,000 vehicles manufactured. So overall, the recovery is looking good. In terms of chip shortages, the electric vehicle market is really still being affected there. But we are seeing global deals across board, partnerships to put in measures to recover production capacity on the chip supply chain.
Okay, now let's play pundit. How much longer now do you think this chip shortage will likely last? And in the worst case scenario, how do you see this also altering the production and sales volume that we'll likely see in the coming days? Look at the medium, long-term future.
I think, like you mentioned, during your introduction, we are likely to. There's no end in sight yet. That's first things first. But what sort of gives us comfort is that we're beginning to see again a lot of regional activity going on in the semiconductor chip manufacturing space. There are a lot of new startups, new companies that are being set up across different regions. So most of the manufacturers are trying to sort of decentralize capacity on that end so that they are not too affected. If there's a downtime in any particular region, they are able to ship capacity to other regions and continue to manufacture. So no end in sight yet, but I believe in another 2 years, we should start to see a bit of a recovery in the sector.
And talking about the reality of electric cars as well now, in terms of the future, what we see playing out here, what's your take on that as well? And then the global adoption of this model of vehicles coming to bear?
It's inevitable, right? When you look at it, that's the future. And the technology investment, research and development that is going into it is a mess. And once you have everyone sort of focused on achieving this goal, in terms of also sustainability and creating a more eco-friendly solution across the board, it's inevitable. We are beginning to see it even closer to home. You have the likes of Total Energy who are beginning to make that transition. In Morocco, for example, every filling station now has a charging port. And because they consume a lot of brand new vehicles, they've also started to move more into the electric vehicle. So it's getting closer to home. Also, the markets that most African countries import their vehicles from are beginning to make that shift as well. So eventually, we'll start to see more uptake across the board in the coming years.
And talking about in the coming years now, let's bring the conversation back home to domestic happenings. What's your take on the current import duty levy on cars we have in Nigeria today, and also this pegged age limit of imported used cars and the electronic valuation system? What new intricacies do you think this is bringing to the fore, industry engagement and reshaping the auto market here in the country? How comfortable are you with these scenarios here?
I think first things first, we must identify that the automotive policy was designed and drawn out to be achieved over the spread of about 8 to 10 years, right? So a lot of these things we are seeing now are an offspring of the automotive policy that had already been designed, right? Data transparency is not a bad thing, and also moving the minimum, the baseline age vehicle requirement in the country is also fantastic. It gets us closer to where we want to be in terms of brand new vehicle consumption and ultimately brand new vehicle manufacturing. Now, the challenges are where the education of policy, how you explain it to people, how you get stakeholders to come on board, and all of that, right? That's where a lot of the work needs to be done. Government needs to spend a bit more time in terms of educating people around policies that are going into play and getting all stakeholders to sort of get on the platform. But overall, it's a fantastic move. Like just for example, in Cote d'Ivoire, you can import a vehicle older than 5 years old, which has moved the economy closer to and consuming brand new vehicles and overall moving that industry to the next level. So I think it's a very welcome policy, and we look forward to the execution by the government and all stakeholders.
And for those who are not comfortable with this move, what's your word to them?
Well, I think change is constant, and even in business, right, you have to analyze, do a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses. So for all, and that's the thing again, in terms of educating and carrying stakeholders along, you would always find a space to play to balance out at the end of it. There's a lot of opportunity in the market. So I don't think that it should shake people off their boots too much.
Well, now as a player in the car finance space as well, with the rising domestic inflationary pressure we have to deal with, this also means transferred cost and a further spike in the cost of cars. But how do you see this slimming down the prospect of purchasing and car financing in Nigeria today? We're yet to have that big boom within the auto space, looking at car financing. But now that we have a bigger pressure we have to deal with, inflation, how is this affecting the market here?
Well, inflation affects all sectors of the economy, really. And when you look at purchasing capacity, it boils down to GDP per head or per household, and excess cash flow. Technically, that's what people then start to play around with. But as that starts to shrink based on inflation, it of course reduces purchasing capacity, and what you will see happen is that people start to move based on priority. I think transport is a huge priority, transport of people, transport of goods. And overall, I think it's a good time for people to take on the financing option. If they're unable to pay or have extra cash to pay for your vehicles in full, now is a good time to take on the financing option to make that purchase.
But don't you think that with this long-term financing plan as well, that affects based on the inflationary pressure? Take, for example, you have the vehicle pegged at 18 million naira, for example, and then paying the interest that accrues over that. But when inflation also bites further, say halfway through the mark, how do you see this tilt in the balance of the overall payment, and how does that affect players like yourself?
Oh, I think overall, right, it's the entire economy that is affected overall once again. And as people take loans today, as inflation, rises today, I think that most importantly is how do we start to reduce inflation? What sort of measures will be put in place by government to reduce inflation, which should overall make things easier for the consumer. So we basically are in a position where we are watching very closely in terms of the physical and monetary policies. We work with banks and other financial institutions. So we're very much in terms of in line with what's going on, and we're able to quickly make adjustments where needed.
Mm. Okay, now let's talk about some recent news also affecting your desk at AutoCheck. Now, we're also looking at AutoCheck acquiring Coinafrique to drive the Francophone African expansion area. And then we're also seeing collaborations now with the CFAO as well. Now, you're partnering with this brand as well. Let's have the updates with these.
So the French-speaking region, Francophone, is home to some of the fastest growing economies in Africa. So if you look at Ivory Coast, currently fastest growing economy, and Senegal, which is poised to be overtake Cote d'Ivoire in about 2023 next year. So it's one for us. It was a very strategic move in terms of getting into the markets. Coinafrique is in 10 different markets. They've been in the market for over 5 years, so they've done a lot of the groundwork. For us, it was very strategic in terms of market entry strategy, and then being able to utilize the platform they have built to then work with banks and other financial institutions to provide credit for consumers. And I think with CFAO, of course, as we all know, they are very significant across the continent, not just in Nigeria, in terms of automotive, right? So it was very strategic for us as well. We need to work with people who have been in the industry, people who understand the part of policy making, to deepen our offering to general consumers. So for us, partnership, acquisitions, these are our core strategies in terms of expansion and building business. So, yeah.
Wrapping up our conversation now, we have to look at some analysis of the second half of the year based on the play out we saw in the first half of the year. What's your prediction overall now, looking at the market, the auto industry markets now? What's your take on what will likely play out within the remaining months of this year, as we also set our sights for the year 2023? And also make some more extensive projections. What's your take for the local market here?
For me, I believe the year is going to end out strong. Yes, we have an election coming early next year. There's a lot of activity going on in the business space, in the government space as well, which, overall, goods and people have to be moved. So for us, it's looking good. And we expect to end out the year pretty strong as well.
Do you think this would also reflect on those assembling vehicles here in the country, this optimism?
Yes, I believe, with as we discussed earlier, in terms of the policies as well for imports, overall, it trickles back and starts to also affect them. So yes, I believe so. I believe that we'll see a lot of uptake in terms of these people manufacturing in the country.
Thank you so much for your time on the show today, Mr. Yam. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. And then we'll also keep our fingers crossed to see how well we see the auto industry here in Nigeria perform. And also this lingering chip shortage, once again, we hope it comes to a quick end. And then we have the recovery within the auto market bounce even much stronger. Thank you once again for your time.
All right. Thank you very much.